Today is November the 15th, 2019. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University, and along with me today is Ben Pollard, a retired from the Oklahoma Conservation Commission. And we're here in Weatherford to talk with Larry Wright, who is a retiree of the Nrcs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And current president of the Oklahoma Association of Conservation Districts. Okay, thank you for letting us come today.
Thank you. Welcome.
And this is going to be part of our Oklahoma's Conservation Heritage Oral History Project, which is a collaboration between the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. So let's begin with learning when and where you were born.
I was born in Hinton, Oklahoma. And Hinton at that time had a hospital and I believe one doctor. But anyway, it was a small town, small hospital. But yeah. I even found a receipt where my parents paid all the hospital and delivery fees, and I think it was around $100.
And what year was that?
That was 1954.
Okay, then tell us a little bit about your parents.
Okay, my parents, of course, they grew up in that area. Actually, they grew up east of Hinton in rural communities, and a lot of farming background, both of them. And my dad farmed his entire life, farmed and ranched. My mom was a teacher and taught for 35 some years. And back in those days, she didn't get credit for those months she had to take off for the birth of all of her children. So, but anyway, a long-term teacher. Both were active in the community and involved with things like that.
So how many siblings?
I have, I got two brothers, and we each had a sister. I'm going to trick you on this number. Now, how many is that? You know, she'll appreciate this because we tease her. But it was one sister. We all had the same sister, but she was always the sister of the brother who was not present if it was a conversation going on. So.
And where are you in the lineup?
I'm the second. I'm the middle child.
You're the middle child. And you grew up on a farm, or at least exposed to farms?
Grew up on the farm every day, but our house was actually in town.
Okay.
That made it more convenient for my mom to close enough she actually walked to school. But yeah.
So do you remember the first time you drove a tractor?
Oh, the first time I can remember a lot of times driving a tractor. I couldn't tell you exactly how old I was. But I would grab the steering wheel and have to really stretch and push to reach the brake.
That's pretty young.
Yeah, so I was just a small child.
And what were some of your chores?
Doing field work, driving a tractor, feeding cattle. We had horses for a lot of my childhood here, and feeding the horses. My dad had raised some registered Appaloosas. And so we did that. When I got, probably, gosh, I don't remember how old it was. My dad also managed the cotton gin, did seed and fertilizer sales and that kind of thing from the cotton gin. And before I was able to do old enough or big enough to do a whole lot, I remember making the metal bands that would go around those 500 pounds of cotton in those bales, and just couldn't keep on a pair of gloves. They would wear out so fast handling those steel bands and moving the trailers around in the yard. And I ran the suction equipment in the yard. And when my dad would run all the stands inside there, separating the lint from the seed and the hulls.
What was the name of the cotton gin?
Pollard cotton gin was the name.
So did you have to pick cotton too, or just?
I did some cotton picking.
Did you?
I sure did. Yeah, and that's, part of the story I say is my dad raised cotton. He raised wheat, milo, and cotton. I believe were his three major crops. And one of the lessons I learned when I went to college was, when I saw my dad quit raising cotton, was he wasn't raising cotton all those other years. He was just raising boys. Yeah. It's something to keep us busy, keep us out of trouble.
Did the sister have to do chores, similar chores?
She didn't do a lot of the farm work. She would help mom around the house with chores there.
Okay. And about how far from school did you live?
From school, one of the schools was a block and a half. The other school was just about probably 2.5 blocks away.
So you walked?
Yeah, walked to school every day. It wasn't uphill in the snow every day, but no, it was easy to get to in a small town. It's other than going to one of our schools, we did cross the highway. And one day my youngest brother tried to tackle a Greyhound bus. But he walked into the side of the bus. The neighbor girl that was older than him to help him get across, she took a false step, and he thought she was going across, and he hurried to cross and ran into the Greyhound bus as it was going by.
Learn a lesson, be quick,
Yeah.
pay better attention.
But I was coming from the high school at that time, which was like a 90-degree difference in my walk from his, and heard her screaming, and I could see him laying on the pavement. It scared me to death. But,
And who told Mom?
yeah, exactly. Because she, who took that job, right?
So what was the name of the elementary school and the high school?
Hinton Elementary, Hinton Junior High, Hinton High School. Real hard names, but yeah.
It is. And what year did you graduate from high school?
Graduated from high school in 1972.
And did you have a favorite subject? Least favorite subject?
I don't know. I did enjoy school. Enjoyed high school. It was easy for me, I guess. Is why, and it was easier than farm work. Because as soon as school was out, I would start doing chores and stuff. But yeah.
Were you an FFA or 4-H?
I was on that, and I served in all the officer positions, and started as a parliamentary, and went into vice president, and I believe I served 2 years as president, actually, of our OOHRP chapter.
And what were your projects? One or two of your projects?
My projects were judging. I did land judging. I did livestock judging. I did shop work.
And were you in sports or?
I was, yeah. Football was my favorite, sport. So.
And the name of the team?
Comets, the Hinton Comets. Yeah, there are very few names of teams that are Comets, but yeah.
Did you win very many games?
I don't know what the record was. That goes way back. We never made it to state. I know that because our difficulty in those days was Thomas, which is up in the northern part of the Deer Creek Conservation District now. And of course, I know some of the guys now that I actually played against, but Thomas was the big school in our district that always went to state. And they kind of knocked us out from going to state because we were in the same conference. So yeah.
And did your mother teach at that same school? Did you have her as a teacher
I
since
did.
she taught?
I did have. I took. She taught business, typing, shorthand, those kind of things. I don't guess anybody does shorthand anymore, but I took typing, which when computers came along, my keyboard skills were put back to use.
Came in handy, didn't
They did. They sure did.
Well, in high school, were you planning on what you might do after? What were you thinking your long-term plans might be?
Oh, this kind of ties into maybe some other things in where I am today. But in the 8th grade, up to that point, I was very interested in being a pilot, going into the Air Force. I got glasses when I was in the 8th grade. Because and how that came about being at the end of my 7th grade year, the class went to a movie in a movie theater, and I'm sitting there with my best friend and towards the back of the theater, and when the end of the movie goes up and they scroll all the credits, my friend starts reading them. I said, "You can read that?" And he said, "Yeah, I can read that." I said, "I didn't know that." And he gave me his glasses, and man, I could read. All those years, I would, after class, or I'd go up to the chalkboard to read the chalkboard because being W for Wright, I was always at the back of the room. And until then, I didn't know anybody could read the chalkboard. When the teacher was writing on the chalkboard, I'd go up and write down whatever it was they said and wrote down.
Hmm.
But anyway, then taking that career class, my teacher says, you can't be a pilot, you wear glasses. And I'm like, gee, break my bubble. But it's out of that same class, that year we did visit the local conservation district, the North Cattle Conservation District there in Hinton. And I remember going into the office and visiting with the district conservationist, the district secretary, and the technicians that were working there at the time, and not really understanding all that they did, but that was my first visit to a local conservation district office.
Had someone from that office been out to your dad's farm?
Yeah, they had, because yeah, my dad we had farms. I can remember one farm that we had, it had some of the longest terraces. You could, if you were driving a tractor or a combine on that terrace, you'd think you were there all night.
Mm-hmm.
It was just one of those steep farms that had lots of terraces on it.
And that was back in the day when tractors weren't air conditioned and
No,
all of
no,
that.
you had, yeah. They had lights, so that's why I mentioned at night when you'd almost get lost. You just follow that same terrace after you got to the end and go back to where you were. Yeah, it was dusty on occasions. But
Well, at that time, were you aware that they were serving a conservation purpose, the terraces? I mean, had you connected the dots at that point?
I did. And in those days, I can remember having this discussion with a hired hand about plowing a field as a high school, junior high kid, whatever I was. And during this discussion, and he wanted a moldboard over a plow. Oh, it's easier if this is the way you do it. And said, you don't need to be doing this, because if I pulled the plow out and I didn't want to tear that terrace, he was using, basically what he was doing, using a furrow that the plow made to let it steer his tractor. And so I remember having that discussion. All these terraces, as then even I thought, these terraces were put here for a reason. They're important. We shouldn't do anything to tear them up.
That's pretty good for a 16, 17-year-old. Yeah. Okay, so graduation day comes. What next?
Well, even before I graduated high school, in my junior year, the chairman of the conservation district called me up and said, hey, we're wanting to hire some help for this summer. Would you be interested? And he asked, and I said, yeah, that sounds great. And so I went to work for the local conservation district for like $1, or I don't know if it's $1.90. It was, I remember it being well under $2 an hour as a district employee. And they also put me on as a district employee and as a part-time soil conservation service at that time. They had what they called the WAE, which is when actually employed. And as a WAE employee, that actually paid, I think that was the one that probably paid the $1.90. The other one might have been $1.50. But anyway, I did some of that summer, and worked on a lot of watershed sites, doing repairs on some of those, delivering drills, working with the technicians, running those terrace lines, waterways, and putting in a lot of drop structures to control erosion. And a lot of those early practices, a lot of mechanical practice that we were doing to prevent erosion, both wind and water. And really enjoyed being around those individuals, the technicians. And one of the technicians really took an interest in working with me. And he visited with the DC, and the DC said, well, yeah, there's this program we have called Student Trainee. And so I'm 16. I had just got my license not that long ago, and he said, this is it. If you're interested, why don't you go apply for this? Well, you need to be on the Federal Register. So as a 16-year-old kid, I find my way to downtown Oklahoma City and go into the post office basement, big old buildings. We didn't have a lot of two-story buildings in Hinton. And so I went in and took the federal exam, made a 70. That's what it took to pass. But I hadn't even had my senior year of school yet. And so there was a lot of math and stuff, algebra and things that were on that I hadn't even had, but I figured out enough of those questions that I did pass, got on the Federal Register, sent in an intent to enroll at Oklahoma State University. And with those two things on, I was put on as a federal employee, filled out a very long form, 171 or whatever it was called. But I remember it just, you seen those cartoons where paper just rolls out to the floor. It was one of those kind of forms. And we didn't have a lot of copiers back then. And I remember having to fill that out 2 or 3 times. Got on as a student trainee, and then when I did graduate high school, and so I'd already, as a 16-year-old, set in motion what I was going to do and what I am doing for all of my life. And you know, how many of us would let a 16-year-old kid decide what you're going to do? When you think of it from the mature side of life, you think, I wouldn't let a 16-year-old make that decision, but I did, and stayed with it. And during all this interim times between my school, I was working in a different location, gained a lot of experience, and for all those years, I guess I was pleased, blessed, gained a lot of experience, because I worked with a lot of individuals who came to work for the Soil Conservation Service in 1945, and right after World War II. In those years, they hired a lot of individuals, and here I'm at working with these, mostly all men at that time, who were coming to the end of their years of service, because a lot of them did retire in 1975. So I had at least 4 years of working with a lot of individuals with lots of experience. So
they didn't mind sharing that.
No, they didn't. And it's kind of but the way the government works, they can't hire somebody to replace somebody until that individual leaves. And so and that was always a frustration when I did work as a district conservationist, trying to hire new employees when somebody retired. And very, very good experienced employees, and you want to pass that kind of knowledge to the next group, and we were never able to, because we couldn't bring in a new employee and work with that individual in that position until they were actually gone.
Do you want to say who the man was that was your mentor in the early, when you were like 16?
That would be Charles Tarrant, and served as a technician. He was a great example to me, and a lot of what I took from him, not only professionally, how he took a lot of pride in doing good conservation work. He did it on his farm, and he'd even have me come out after hours, and I'd do farm stuff for him. And but he was very active in his church, very active in the community, a leader in the civic organizations, and belonged to the Soil and Water Conservation Society. So he was, in all those things, I took it as an example of what a professional conservationist looks like. He did a lot of photographs. He did all the news articles. As a technician, we don't see this hardly ever. But he did news articles, photographs. You can go in archives, and probably as you archive photographs, there's probably a lot of those with his name on the back of it. But in all my years, he would continue to make an effort to stay caught up with me. And as I worked all around the state for many years, different locations, he was always keeping in touch. And
well, before we get to your career part, then let's back up. You went to OSU.
I went to Oklahoma State University.
And majored in
agronomy.
And graduated in
1976.
Where did you live while you were on campus?
I lived in Kerr Hall on the 11th floor.
Kerr
was the male side, Drummond was the female side.
Did you have a favorite professor, one that sticks out?
A favorite one? Not really.
Favorite class?
I guess I didn't want to play favorites. One class that, when you ask a class that sticks out, is they started offering while I was there, and that hadn't been offered before, because Dr. Jewell, I think he came from Iowa, and he wanted to set up this soil conservation class, and there was this soil conservation book. And trying to think. I know I'm at least a junior, senior at this point. But when he found out I've already had 3 years of experience working in soil conservation, and I pretty much already knew the book, and so there were things he would let me basically use. I guess he used me as an assistant, and there was a whole section on survey, which everybody wanted to go with me when we would go out and do surveys, because I had worked with some great technicians who I learned a lot of good survey techniques, and so they could all make 100 along with me. When you say favorite, it was just, that was really enjoyable, just because my experience made that class so easy.
And he called it soil, not dirt.
That's correct. It's not dirt unless it's on the floor or in your fingernail. Yeah.
There we go.
Were there very many women in that class in the
There,
program at that time?
I think there were even all of agronomy there were only 1 or 2. And I remember one girl in particular. She was interested, and she visited with me, and she was one of the first females I can remember that was hired by the Soil Conservation Service.
And what was her name?
Marlene. She worked for a few years, then I think quit to raise a family or something. But I lost track of her a long time ago.
So graduation day comes, so then what's your first job at that point with your degree, with your college degree?
The first location?
Yeah. Your first job once you get your degree, when you're hired by Nrcs.
Since I was already hired with them.
I should say soil conservation at that time, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
I worked in.
You were already part-time.
I'm already working summers, and so basically I would get a letter before that spring semester was up, telling me where I was going to go work the next summer. The fall, here in a few weeks, you're going to be out of school. We want you to report at this location on this date. So I would show up. One of the things I remember a couple of summers, which I thought was really odd, I worked in Hollis, Oklahoma. Spent a year down there one summer. But the technician got phlebitis, and so I ended up doing a lot of his work because he wasn't able to work. And they hired a WAE at that time to help me. But I had a good DC, and I did learn a lot of stuff from him as well. He would make sure I learned some. And then that happened as well in Muskogee. Another year, then in Muskogee, and the technician had some illnesses, went on a disability just right after I got there. I mean, I may have worked with him 2 or 3 days, I know it wasn't even a full week. Anyway, he's off on disability. They hired WAE. He works with me, and we do all the technician work. So I just remember getting lots of great technical background from doing so much of that, which really helped me during my years as a soil conservationist. And because I could do both, and I could plan stuff knowing how it's going to be designed and make it fit.
Quite a difference from Hollis to Muskogee, I would think, too.
There is a lot of all your resource concerns are tremendously different.
Well, on those summer jobs, where would you live? I mean, it'd just be for what, 2-3 months?
Yeah, generally 3 months. I remember, in Hollis, I took a travel trailer. My dad had a travel trailer. We took it down there, set it up. When I worked in Ada, actually I stayed on campus, got a room, one of the dorm rooms. So I did the trailer, or I'd find something to rent. I had rented an apartment in Oklahoma. So you just find something temporary. Yeah.
So once you finish with these summer jobs, and you were on a yearly one, what was that?
When I graduated from Oklahoma State. Then I went to work in Okmulgee, and so that was my, I don't know if you want to call it permanent, but anyway, I went to Okmulgee. Had a great staff there, and John Worthy was the district conservationist, and worked on a lot of projects. That's probably why I got my first exposure to conservation education work, because we would actually build and set up a booth. We built the booth after hours. I built it in his garage after hours, but we built a great display, and we would set it up at the Tulsa State Fair. Mm-hmm. And that's probably, I would say, that was one of my first exposures to really setting up good conservation education.
So what was your title?
Okay, soil conservationist would have been my title.
When you first initially. So how long were you there?
I was just probably about a year, or 12, 13 months, where it was. Yeah.
And then you moved, or they sent you somewhere else, or if you?
Then I went from Okmulgee to Norman, Cleveland County. Worked there. And part of that might have been, I would have to give Fred Fortney the credit for that one. He was our state resource conservationist, because he knew I was interested in getting married, and the girl I was very interested in lived in South Oklahoma City, going to U.S. Grant High School. That's where she was located, in that area. So that put me close enough to her. Then we did marry and began that part of my life. Yeah.
So in your course of things, how many times did you have to move? Do you know that right off? How many times you moved? How many times you moved?
Counting those years as a student trainee.
Sure, I know.
Yeah. I remember my first 10 years, I moved 10 times.
Wow. Gaining experience with each move.
Sure.
I'm assuming.
Gained a lot of great experience. Sometimes I learned what not to do, which was just as important as learning what to do. Yeah.
Did you have a favorite location of all of those 10 moves?
I really enjoyed working with farmers and cropland, and I like working in rangeland. And in fact, you probably could say my degree was in agronomy, but I almost had a minor in soil science and almost a minor in rangeland management, because I took all my electives in those two areas. I could have had 3 more hours in each of those two categories and had 3 degrees. But that's why I did all my course selection based on the questions people would ask me during the summer. Mm-hmm. And I took ag engineering because I would get a lot of engineering questions about, well, how do you run these drills, and some of the equipment a lot of the districts would rent. And so I just tailored my education towards whatever questions I might have gotten. If I worked in on the east side of the state, got a lot of grassland, grazing land, rangeland kind of questions, some about forestry and that one. And so I would always enroll in those kind of classes.
Knowing that that's what your long-term plan was, to stay in that area, so that was proactive and smart to do. So you went from Hollis to Muskogee to
Ada would have been as far as southeast.
Ada, Okmulgee.
Ada's in Pontotoc County.
No, and then you went to Okmulgee, and then Cleveland County, Norman. Then where? If you want to just run us through.
After Cleveland County, I went to Creek County at Bristow. Okay. And I have 2 sons. We had 2 sons, and they were both born in Bristow. Yeah. And I was renting a house. I mean, talking about where you live. I rented a house that was 5 or 6 blocks from the office, and the hospital was only a block more from the office. Yeah, I could walk to work, which was as a young family and
Watching pennies.
watching all those pennies. That was great to not have to depend on a second vehicle a lot of the times, and keeping them maintained and fuel.
So each time you moved, did you have a choice, or would they just tap you on it and say you're going?
I guess within my own mind, I had some ideas of where I would like to go eventually. And, I was talking about Charles Tarrant. He always wanted me to come back to Hinton. And he would talk to the state office many times, always asking them to send me back to Hinton. And of course, the policy at that time was, we don't want to put employees back in their hometowns. That was a big deal, for whatever reasons there may have been. And that hasn't been a big deal for 20 years now, but it was then. And but I remember he was always wanting me to come back, because he just wanted me there to do some things. But anyway, I kind of had some ideas of where I did want to go, and the office I thought was very active. It was one of the things I always wanted. I wanted offices that were very active, very involved, and that had a good reputation. And so I had some of those in mind, and just tried to hopefully get to one of those, and which I felt like I did. I really did.
So from Bristow, where?
From Bristow, I went to Rush Springs. That's Grady County Conservation District.
Getting closer to home then.
Yeah, I was.
And doing similar things.
I worked as a district conservationist, sure. I did, well, even when I was in Bristow, the soil conservationists, they essentially gave me a pilot project to work on there, on some land treatment on some watersheds. And same thing happened when I got to Rush Springs. They said, well, we have what we call a model implementation project. And satellites were starting to become a big deal. And so the Landstat would go around, make a complete revolution around the earth just in a matter of a few days, taking these aerial satellite images. And so they said, well, on this little Ouachita River watershed area here in Grady County, and at that time there was an agricultural research service that was located there at Chickasha. And so they set up monitors and stream flows and runoff from fields and bar ditches and different places where they could measure sedimentation, the silt in the water, what the flow of the water is, the volume, and the speed, and all those kind of things. And they set up all these stations. And so that was one of my first projects in working with the ARS. And I continued that all through the rest of my career, working with various ARS. And so my job was, they offered a 90% cost share incentive, which was unheard of, and it's probably never been done before. But the idea was to do as much work, conservation practices, put those best management practices on the land as quick as we could. And we did a tremendous amount of conservation work in that watershed in just a matter of a year. A lot of work. And that way ARS could gather the data and be able to verify the benefits of all of our conservation practices. Everything from terraces and waterways and concrete lined outlets and other pipe drops and grass planting. And so it was fun to work with that kind of project, because it took the economic factor of whether the landowner could afford to do the work or not. And at 90% cost share, it's one of those things. You cannot afford to miss this opportunity.
Sounds like it was not a 40-hour-a-week job. That's what I'm thinking too. You're spending more hours.
Well, it may have been, but conservation's been my life. So anyway.
And that would have been what time period, when you were in Rush Springs? In the 80s?
81 to 82.
Okay. A little bit before the Farm Bill came in. Then it was a little later.
Yeah.
So how long were you in Rush Springs?
That it was less than 2 years, but well over a year.
So most places were short term 1 to 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other part of that was, and for sure in those days, is as a soil conservationist or even as a district conservationist, if you wanted to advance, get a promotion, it did require a move. Back then, they didn't upgrade you and let you stay in the same location. And I have seen that happen over the last several years. I see that happening. I think that employee's not gaining as much experience as I think they should. How much, when you gain so much experience and moving often, yeah, it's difficult. And it has become more difficult for families nowadays because both in the household are working to make the income to take care of the needs. And so that does hinder some of the benefits of gaining that extra experience.
So each time you were about to move, you would go home and say, "Guess what, dear? We're going to."
Well, yeah, I'd say, well, there's
wherever.
I would tell her there's this opening, and said I'm really interested in it, and she was always supportive. She'd say, "It's yeah, if you want to go, you want to put in for it, I'm behind you." So.
Not even wait a year. Let's wait a year.
Yeah. And some of those moves were difficult. And moving and began my career in Weatherford with the Deer Creek Conservation District as a district conservationist in January of 1983. And having 2 young boys at home, that took 6 months before I could, because that was at the end of oil boom, and when I came to Weatherford, prices had not come down on any of the real estate houses. Everything was still so expensive, and
interest rates were like 13% or something.
They were 21%. They were ridiculous. Yeah, that was very difficult. It just took a long time. And
what was the motivation to come back to Weatherford for that move? I mean, what was besides it being home?
Well, yeah, close enough to home.
What was going on in the district that you were wanting to?
When I looked at the conservation district, I knew they were very active. Like I say, in the ones that were always active, if you attended any of the meetings with conservation districts or the Soil Conservation Service, still at that time, you would have an opportunity to meet some people or see or just find out what their activities were. And having grown up close enough, I had seen some things going on over here in this district, and I saw they had a great mix of cropland, rangeland, pasture land, and knew there would be some opportunities, and saw what some of the concerns were, and thought, yeah, that'll be a good place to go.
So that was 83, and then did you retire from the same?
No,
or did you move okay. Continued to move. Huh?
I did. Well, I didn't continue to move from Weatherford because I spent a little over 19 years as a district conservationist with the Deer Creek Conservation District in Weatherford.
Okay.
And at this time, we're now the Nrcs, Natural Resource Conservation Service. We're going through another reorganization. Been through one, going through another, and an opening occurred for the Resource Conservation and Development, Rcnd, part of the Nrcs. And it was that office was located in Cordell, 30 miles from here. Anything less than 32 miles or whatever was, you don't move. You're not required to move, or they're not going to pay for a move. And so I began that commute and doing that job there. But even as a district conservationist here, I was probably the most active district doing Rcnd projects. And I saw and worked with those couple of different coordinators during those years, and enjoyed that, because as I mentioned, my mentor, I was active in my church, I was active in civic, and I was school board, and I did all those things, and and knowing all, having that interest in doing community and rural development, and was a good fit, was a real good fit. When all of a sudden there's consolidation going on within Nrcs and trying to consolidate people into less offices, and so I just, that was kind of like a door's closing but a door's opening for me.
You're always thinking one step ahead, it seems like, too, planning ahead. What were some of the projects for the Rcnd that you did or involved with?
Gosh, we did a lot. We did a lot of solid waste management plans for all the counties out here in western Oklahoma. I did a lot of roadside erosion control work. We did emergency watershed protection jobs. A couple of projects, well, there's probably 3 or 4 that were really big statewide events that I put together. And one of them was Women in Agriculture and Small Business. We started that out of our Rcnd office. And that was, I think, a very successful project. It benefited a lot of individuals. I can remember Jennifer Reynolds, who was anchor on Oklahoma City News Channel for years. I would have her come and speak at some of these conferences, and she would always say, "This is the most real conference I've ever been to." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" She said, "You have real people here. You don't have employees. You don't have government employees or just people who come and speak and who are paid to be here. You have people that are willing to take their own day and time to be here." And she said, "I've never seen a meeting like this." Mm-hmm. And I remember that was almost a little bit of an aha moment too, but it was an assurance that it's a good thing. And we did that for several years. Another one was I began promoting no-till conservation work. And at that time, so here we are in 2000, and the last push was in the mid-'80s from Natural Resource Conservation Service. And a big person in that was John Riley, who was actually the DC back when I was in 8th grade in Hinton. He was the DC there. But at this point, he's a resource conservationist covering multi areas of the state, promoting no-till. And he and I worked on a lot of projects here at the Deer Creek office. And we had a couple of individuals that were innovators in no-till. And we used them. They were great examples. And we did some workshops with those individuals. So now I'm an Rcnd. And so I have an opportunity to revisit and promote that when nobody else is. And I say why nobody else is. It's a lot of it comes on experience again and what their knowledge is. And a lot of our district conservations, they didn't know anything about no-till. So they didn't know how to promote it or talk about it. Same way with the extension agents. Well, I would start out with meetings, find some good individuals that were doing a great job and that were willing to speak before a group. And I would get them to do a workshop, maybe cover their mileage or something, and 20, 40, 100, 150, 300 people show up. They just kept growing and growing and growing. And for sure, when I hit the 300 mark, the NRC state office calls me. OSU calls me. I said, "Well, what's going on? What is this?" I said, "We didn't think anybody was interested. And you're having meetings with 150 to 300 people showing up?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "There is an interest. Our farmers, producers want to know more about this, because in order for them to be sustainable, not only mitigate risks, but also protect their profit line, they got to take care of their soil." And so, yeah, they want to know more about it. Well, we talked to our field people, and they're telling us there's not anything. Nobody's interested in that. I said, "Well, the real problem is you have people out in the field who don't know, and so what can they say? A producer comes in and asks a question, they don't have an answer. So they're telling you there's no interest because they don't know how to do that." And so we made the project a statewide project with OSU being interested now. NRCS is willing, so now I have some financial resources I can pay for a bigger venue and have a statewide meeting. And so I began to do that. And as I worked with OSU on this, I can remember talking to I think there was 3 professors at that time I worked just directly with. And when I got them involved, I said, we need speakers. And said, I got this one individual, he's going to be great. I said, to tell you why you need to do this. You all probably know how to do it, but you can talk to somebody about how to do something all day long, but if they don't know why to do it, you're not going to change it. They need to know why. So I brought it, and I actually think his last name was Farmer, Val. I remember Val, Farmer, and he had a book, and it talked about why. And I had him come in and speak as my keynote speaker at that first statewide event. And then we brought in our OSU expertise to talk about how. And so we did that, and I think that really turned the tide on the no-till conservation work in the state of Oklahoma. It's because as we did reports for years, I think we were only getting up to about 30% cropland under no-till. It seemed like we hit a plateau, and then we began to move it higher. So then probably what I really had fun doing is, and I would have, again, the third reorganization is about to happen in 2010-11, and I did a conference in 2010 called Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food, and had well over 300 people come in for this one. I did it at Redlands Community College and out at Darlington. And Darlington, it's kind of a combination area of work. It's an old wildlife game. They used to raise quail there at one point. But anyway, that had kind of been, all the stuff been done away with through the wildlife department and some other work. And but Redlands Community College and Agriculture Research Service all had land right there with that, and so we did a great evening event out there in conjunction to all the normal seminars and presentations we did up at Redlands during the day. But it was really fun, and I reached a whole different audience. With that event, we began to reach more into the urban and community kind of ag.
Were you getting much pushback from, I know trying to sell farmers on this, were you getting those who just said, no, never do it still? On
the no-till part?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something most people are still out there. They don't push back like really. It's more of a defense they put up.
So if it was 30% before, what is it? How far did you get it raised now? Roughly.
My observation might be we may be I would have to really think we're at least half. As I drive around or up and down the highways today in my travels, I would say at least half, or maybe it's probably a little higher than that. Because and I say half from actual cropland because there's been a big portion that's actually gone to permanent grass. But from actually land that is raising cultivated, what we would consider cultivated crops, I would say at least half of those. Some of the more highly erodible lands in recent years have gone to a permanent cover, either native grasses or Bermuda or one of the other improved grasses. So.
So this is in 2010-ish. When did you retire from NCRS?
2011.
Well, you were working hard right up to the end, it sounds like, too, then.
Well,
you were trying to educate.
I was, like I said, I started making a lot of inroads into urban agriculture. Mm-hmm. And that was becoming a thing, as we say. It's a thing now. And and for sure then, so it started from that know your farmer, know your food, and we begin to see some opportunities, and Nrcs begin to look at transitioning, and people who are wanting to transition into organic farming, and but this also goes back when I was doing the no-till. One thing when I would speak to the general public, the thing that I saw that resonated better with them than when I'd say, okay, erosion, we're conservation. We're talking about protecting our soils from erosion, either wind and soil, and you try to explain that. That can be a little technical. And that may even go over the general public's head. But in around the 2000s, people begin to talk more about personal health, the health of their body. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, soil health, body health. Maybe they'd understand it better if I talk about the health of our soils, protecting it from erosion, and talk a little bit about how no-till can improve our soil health. And that, I saw that resonate with the public. And so I began to incorporate that into these workshops in any messages when I would talk to people, and I would talk to them about soil health. I even did a project through Rcnd where we measured plant health and the healthy benefits of grain. I used wheat since that's one of our major crops, and I would send grain into a lab in Kansas. There was not a lab in Oklahoma that would do this, and tell me the results of the protein of the grain harvested from fields that had been in continuous no-till. And what I began to find, for those that have been in continuous no-till for more years, the grain had more protein. I was even pulling out grain with 18% protein off these tests, and we sent them back when I was working with the Food and Ag Products Center there at Oklahoma State University as well, and said, we need to verify that because that is high. And we did, and it was. It's like, wow. And so that was like, okay, if we can make our soil healthier, our plants are going to be healthier, so the food's going to be healthier. And if we're eating healthier food, our bodies should be healthier as well. Because not only the protein, but the minerals and vitamins and stuff was showing up, because we had expensive, but a very thorough test run on this grain. And so that was like another aha, wow, that proves it.
Able to connect those dots.
Then when USDA came out several years after we were doing stuff here in Oklahoma, USDA put that as one of their number one priorities, and it has been for several years. And everybody is talking soil health now, which is, it's great to hear, great to see the work. But Nrcs, I think it was Ron Nichols down at Fort Worth, out of the National Technical Service down there, who was in charge of doing campaign marketing kind of stuff, public information. He said if I got his name right, but anyway, I remember him saying this has exploded faster than anything we've ever done. They couldn't produce materials fast enough for people wanting to know more about soil health.
So in your career, Larry, the emphasis initially on mechanical erosion control.
Oh, exactly.
And this has been really a paradigm shift to soil health that's just really caught fire.
And I think about if we knew today what we knew in 1970,
yeah,
I would not have walked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles laying out terraces. Because we could have taken care of the problem at the raindrop, not waiting for it to build up and run off. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're exactly right. We wouldn't have had to do so much mechanical work. And some recent information that comes out of our Oklahoma Conservation Commission and water quality staff. After the recent flooding we've seen this past year, for sure on Arkansas River, because that was on the news nationwide, the damage in Tulsa all the way down to Weber's Falls on the Arkansas River. They did a study on soil health and sequestering carbon in the soil, And if we can raise the carbon content in the cropland on the river basin from the Oklahoma line to Tulsa, just that part of the Arkansas River, if we could raise the carbon content in cropland 1% and 0.5% on the rangeland, that they could store a tremendous amount of water and keeping it from running off in the soil profile, equivalent to all 5 major huge lakes in Oklahoma. Now, if I recall those lakes, we're talking about Grand Lake, Eufaula, Oologah,
Keystone, maybe?
Texoma.
In Texoma, yeah.
Yeah, it's because they were talking about billions and billions. That's equivalent to billions and billions, hundreds of billions of gallons of water, which I can't get my head around that number. But when you tell me all these lakes that I've seen and maybe have been on, I can picture that. That's a lot of water.
So how do you accomplish that?
It's going to take some time because I know it's, again, if we've only gone from 30 to 50, 60% no-till, which is going to keep a lot of carbon in the soil because that carbon's released anytime it's tilled. Cover crops and there's a lot of things we can do with the plants, vegetation, that's going to draw that carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. And you think about carbon as a great filter, great water storage. And we're just learning more about that now. Even I mentioned organic farming. There's a whole thing about biochar where you take essentially charcoal. It's what I picture it as. It's this chunk of charcoal, and organic farmers are putting that in their soil to store water and to take care of some other problems. But so that is a real visual form of the carbon. But carbon is very evident when you just see a dark soil, and it has the more carbon in it, it's going to make the soil darker. You see a real light colored soil, you see some sandy soils. Well, they've been depleted of the carbon, and so they can't store the water. And so building that carbon reserve back into the soil. And historically, and this is a project I worked on as Rcnd again with Agricultural Research Service out of Fort Reno, and we were looking at how can we raise the carbon content in this project and what can we promote to do that. And of course they were set up to measure it and different practices that we could do to raise carbon in our soil. And some of the data, which is, of course the data was historic data, is not real good, but it was estimated at one time we might have been as high as 4% carbon in our soils in Oklahoma. And a lot of our soils now are maybe 1%, are farmed soils. And if we could raise that from 1% to 2%, raise it up that 1% and store a tremendous amount of water. And that even makes me think of, and that's kind of, again, most of our land area in the Deer Creek Conservation District was never funded for upstream flood control. Our southern part of ours that goes into the Ouachita River, because the Ouachita River received more emphasis for had some really devastating floods over the years. And so we got 3 huge flood control. I say huge in terms of what you see in most upstream flood control sites. And but the part that goes into Deer Creek, which ends up in the South Canadian River, all that land area never was approved for watershed sites. But we did land treatment programs here. And when I look back now, a lot of our land treatment programs, which I didn't know at the time, but I see now, we're storing carbon. And so we were mitigating a lot of our flood issues that we had on the Deer Creek stream itself. So I think, gosh, if we could do that on Arkansas River and not have part of Tulsa or even Weather Falls hurt so bad in this recent flooding, which is open to happen again if we don't change some other things. But
You spend a lot of time educating. It sounds like got some of your mother's genes in you.
Well, and you mentioned my mom, and I remember her telling me, she said, I always thought one of my kids, this is her words, I always thought one of my kids would be a teacher. I said, well, Mom, I teach Sunday school, Bible study in my church. So I may miss 2 Sundays a year. So I said, I teach 50 days every year, a Bible study group. I'm doing workshops, I'm doing education in schools for kids, I'm doing adults. I said, I'm doing all these other workshops, so I'm actually teaching. I don't know what number I told her when I told her that, but anyway, I know it's well over. I said, I'm teaching over, because I was teaching facilitation, and I was doing some other extra duties for Nrcs at that time as well. So I was traveling around the country putting on other training events for employees of Nrcs. So I'm well over 100 days a year teaching, and which is getting, what, 180 days for a teacher in public schools.
Did that satisfy her?
I think it helped. I think it did. Yeah. But she was thinking public schools. But yeah, and not setting out to be a teacher. I was on a conservation path, you know.
So you're doing some work with children as well? It wasn't just all adults?
Yes. Yeah. So when I did come to Weatherford in 1983, and I had a board member, Carol Gott, who was a principal in an elementary school, and he was on the board here at Deer Creek, and I said, we ought to do some conservation outdoor classroom. And he said, yeah, I like that, because he was a good farmer, and it still is, and but he was very interested in conservation, being a professional educator. So we began some stuff. We put on our first outdoor classroom for 4th graders, and why I picked 4th grade, but 4th grade is a great group of kids to work with. I did some other works with younger kids in classrooms, and you get this a lot, and it's not a question, they start telling you a story. They're great, but if you're trying to give information to them, if you answer all those hands that come up, you're just going to listen to, well, my grandpa or my grandma, you listen to some story. And little immature to go outside. And 5th grade's okay. 6th grade, they start to have an attitude, is my opinion. So I concentrated and stayed with the 4th grade. And the other thing is, when I look back, when I'm talking about Charles Tarrant as a mentor, his wife was my 4th grade teacher. And as a 4th grade, I knew very little of what he did. I just knew, as you might have mentioned, what her husband did. But for 38 years, we've done an outdoor classroom here. And we probably, all those years, we probably averaged about 300. We have had more. We've had some schools with their budgets drop out and their concentration on what their teachers are trying to do in the classroom. They don't do many, some of the schools don't do many field trips anymore. But yeah, even though I did Rcnd, we set that up as an Rcnd project, which I could go out and bring more people, because it takes a lot of volunteers. Just to do our outdoor classroom, we'll probably have 30 people come in as volunteers to help put that on. When you're running that many students, and we're setting up 12 different classes, 20, 30 minutes each during the day. And
what would be some of the things you would teach?
We would have class, they're all natural resource related, conservation related. So we'll talk about soils. We'll have a soil scientist do one. We'll have somebody do something on range and grasses, water quality, water issues. We use the biology up here at Southwestern Oklahoma State University A lot of their students come in, we set up a whole aquatic thing, and they set up pans of water and all the the little bitty bugs in the water. So they'll gather up all those things, and the kids get to play in that water and find those insects that live in the water, and learn which ones are beneficial and what are indicators of water quality. And but that hands-on, do wildlife, we'll do trees, we'll do all kinds of ag and natural resource related. Sometimes some of those individuals may have a conflict, they're not back, we may have to change a class or two. But and one thing I've kind of implemented into it is, because I know the teachers have to do STEM, so I'll make sure we talk about science, technology, engineering, and math. And if it's just explaining what an acre of land is, and you get into some math, or tell them about the science of why we're doing these erosion control kind of projects, and how we're protecting the soil, or engineering of conservation practices. So we can bring, and I always look at the teachers when those subjects are tied in to conservation, and you get that in teachers' eyes. Oh, yeah. And they appreciate it because they can see how it ties together with what they're mandated.
Added value all the way around.
Yeah, try to. We can't, yeah, just being aware of what and where to put value into it. So.
Have any of those students come back around to be employees?
Well, that is very interesting when you bring that question up, because 25 years ago, at an outdoor classroom for 4th grade students, there was this young boy who today would admit that he might have been a terror to teachers, came to our outdoor classroom, had an aha moment himself. As a 4th grader, he said, "This is what I want to do." So he became a better student, went on to Oklahoma State University, got a degree in agronomy, moves back to Weatherford, is farming, sets up a crop consulting business, and one of our board members, closer to his age than me for sure, but anyway, says, "Hey, you ever thought about being an associate on the Conservation District Board?" And had that talk with him, and he said, "Yeah." And then that's when he relayed his story. And well, now he's a full Conservation District Board member for Deer Creek, but we started him out as associate, and then had an opening when one of our longtime board members retired, filled that position. And to me, that you asked that question, that is just an amazing story. I have run into students, I have run into young adults, and one sticks out really in my mind, this girl who's carrying a baby. I run into her and she says, "I know you. Who are you?" Of course, I don't recognize her. And so when I mentioned Deer Creek Conservation District, she said, "That's it. When I was in the if this doesn't make you feel old, when I was in the 4th grade, and you're talking to this young mom with a baby in her arms, and when I was in the 4th grade, I remember you." And I'm thinking, when somebody's now they're 30 and they can remember when they were in the 4th grade, and they remember what was taught in one day.
Mission accomplished, yes.
And I've talked to teachers about that as well. And I say, when you take kids outdoors, their minds open up, you give them hands-on, and they receive the message. And that's what we do in our outdoor classrooms.
And they're still going on today.
Yeah.
So you came to Deer Creek Conservation District in what year?
January of 83.
83. You've been here. And I'm the board of directors. And have you been? And you're the current director.
I am a director on the Deer Creek Conservation Board. When I retired,
yeah, why don't you explain how you retired from Nrcs and then decided, gosh, I want to get back in and now be a conservation district director. I want to hear this story, Larry.
And that's kind of a broad story because I did, as an Rcnd coordinator, I did a lot of work with organizing boards and helping boards as a nonprofit and other nonprofits. So I gained a lot of experience doing that kind of work. So when I retired and I'm no longer employed by Nrcs, still living here, which made me eligible, the board came to me and said, hey, we'd like for you to be an associate. And but I had a lot of boards approach me quickly, a lot of organizations, more than I could say yes to. But I did say yes to the Deer Creek Conservation District Board. And so they put me on as associate, and then I mentioned Carol Gott, and we had always been great friends. And he says, after a period of time, because he's dealing with his wife's Alzheimer's and had for several years, and it was taking a toll on him health-wise, and taking a lot of his time because he's a full-time caregiver. And he says, you know, Larry, I would retire if you would take my position. So, okay, I said yes again. So within a few months as associate, I'll become a full voting member of the Deer Creek Conservation Board. And then with my background experience, then the Oklahoma Association of Conservation Districts thought, we need some of that nonprofit experience, financial experience, working for us, helping us out. So I did that on a just kind of a limited contract, just take care of the books, treasury, getting all that financial stuff squared away they needed some help with, and grants that were being worked on, and I had a lot of that grant experience. And so I did that a few years, and then I was approached with, well, how about being a vice president? I said, well, as a vice president, I can keep doing what I'm doing, but you cannot pay me, because that would seem like a conflict. I mean, it was just a stipend anyway, but it's, even though in the bylaws it didn't say they couldn't pay an officer, I said, my work with boards has always been officers don't get paid. So I said, under those terms, I'll become a vice president, and OOHRP has 3 vice presidents. So I did that for several years. And so all the past presidents began to talk, well, consider being president. So I am now currently serving as president of the Oklahoma Association of Conservation Districts.
And what does that entail?
What does it entail? Well, as a president, for sure you're handling the governance of the association and leading the board. Working with our executive director. She is a contract employee. We have to help administer some grants. We have a few other employees that she actually kind of more or less supervises. They're all on part-time contract basis to assist with several grants, so that's what's funding the hours that they put in. But just make sure we're staying on mission.
And it's volunteering your time as well.
Yes.
And about how many hours a month or a week is it?
Oh my goodness. And for this week, it's already been 30 some hours.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it takes time. And part of what I do on my farm, you know, I need to, if I was teaching people about know your farmer, know your food, how to do urban agriculture, organic farming, and a lot of those things I did in my last several years in Rcnd. So I'm doing a lot of that stuff on my farm. And I was helping set up farmers markets, help people learn and do direct marketing. And so I'm doing direct marketing. I'm doing farmers markets myself. I do one of my joys is doing a farmers market with my oldest granddaughter, because she loves it. And so I'm raising all kinds of vegetables, natural, organic, is the way I'm doing it. And but when you talk about the hours I'm doing as president, I'm thinking that has gotten really tough. So I hadn't told my granddaughter this yet, but I may have to, or may put my vegetable farm into a sabbatical for a year.
Rest the soil.
Rest the soil.
Tanya, if I could insert at this point, I believe Larry would be the only retired Nrcs employee that's ever rose to president of OECD. We've had some Nrcs retirees become district board members, but to get active in OECD and become president, I believe, is a first. I can't think of any off the top of my head that I worked with for sure.
No, I don't recall it. And very few have even become district directors.
Correct.
But there are some.
There are a few. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this is a historic role that Larry's playing here in Oklahoma.
And how many years have you committed to? I know it's one at a time probably, but can you get
typically
really?
Well, the bylaws state 2 consecutive years is. So typically what we do, and that's the same thing the National Association does, our bylaws are very similar, is serve 2 years.
And then off a year and they come back on 2 years.
It's not automatic. If I don't do a good year, if this 1 year is, if I don't do good, they don't have to keep me the second year. But typically most OECD presidents have served 2 years.
That sounds like they've got a good person at the helm. And they won't want you
But
to leave.
And conservation is part of who I am, I guess.
So I can't imagine you'll give up your farming then. You'll just make time for it. Do it in the dark. And that's a commitment too. What kind of practices are you doing with your organic soil help too, I guess?
I do covers, and of course when I started my garden, I felt like I pretty much just picked that spot and create this garden. I needed to do some tillage, and I did some tillage to incorporate garden or organic matter into the garden, because I'm doing a lot of composting. And I did a trial this year on doing a compost windrow. I went out into, it was grassed area, but it's a lot of what I just all native grass anyway, so it's not totally Bermuda. So I till it, and I had this 10-foot wide spot that was about almost 50 foot long, and I started composting in it, and I get compost from 2 restaurants plus my house. So I start building this compost windrow in almost a raised format, and I started that, and so I planted tomatoes plants and trails on the edge of that compost, and the rest of my garden is fenced to keep the wildlife out, because I'm out in the middle of all my rangeland, which really makes it good because I don't have neighbors spraying around me, any chemicals coming in or drifting or from runoff. So I do drip watering on all that, and I do some intensive trellising on tomatoes, 2 ways on. But anyway, back to the windrow, I thought, well, I'm going to experiment with this. And even as dry as it was during most of this year, I had to water that very little with all that compost going in, and I would continue to feed compost in it. And part of that idea came from I watched Oklahoma gardening, and Casey was showing these keyhole gardens. They were raised beds in the backyard was the idea, but like a big circle with a little space you could walk up in with a compost in the center, and you would feed your household compost in the center, and essentially what they know is that will feed out 3 feet from that center. So that's however big your center is for compost, you can make the outside perimeter of this raised area 3 foot off that. And so I'm thinking, I'll just do a windrow and use that kind of same information. And those tomatoes did really good. And then I'll get back to some of what I'm doing in practice as far as drip. I do the drip watering, and for sure, that's the only way I could do it with my time, because I could go turn my well on, let the drip system run for an hour, and my entire garden is watered. And on my covers, and this I mentioned the sabbatical. It's when you farm in a lot of vegetables, they begin to have a problem with the rip knot nematode, because the population of rip knot nematode builds up under vegetable crops, for sure. They're under all crops, and it can cause a problem. But anyway, so in my covers right now, with my cover right now, I'm doing a lot of elbon rye, because elbon rye will tie up the nematodes, that grass, those grass roots. Sudan grass is a good cover, and I'll use Sudan grass, that's a summer grass, as for help control nematodes. They're microscopic. It's a lot of the 2 ways I control bugs. It's all mechanical. It's generally hand picking. Hand pick those tomato worms off. Trick I found out worked pretty good on squashes. You go squirt water on your squash plants. All those squash bugs run out to the edge of the leaves to try to get dry. Take a shop vac, hit the edge of that leaf, and take those little squash bugs away.
And do what with them? What, do you send them back in the compost?
No. I let them die inside that shop vac.
So how many acres do you do this to?
I have my total produced per area for farmers markets is about an acre. What I'm doing vegetables on is probably, it's a little over ½ acre. That's a lot of work for one person. That's about all I can keep up with. But
and then the rest of your farm is what?
Rangeland, and all native grasses. It's in the cross timbers, so I do have the oaks and the cedars. A couple of invasives, the cedars and the feral hogs.
We were going to ask about if that had become a problem in this county, this district.
Yeah, so I'm all the time clipping cedar trees or cutting them with a chainsaw, remove them. I focus on the seed producing trees first on my cedars, and if I don't get rid of the seed producing trees, then you're not going to get ahead of them. So if I see one full of those little blue cedar seeds, I make sure I go by and get that one cut and work on whatever else is around it.
And then burn it, or how do you dispose of it?
I do some patch burning for wildlife management. I consider myself managing all those acres of rangeland area, and within this canyon, I do it at the pollinator level. And I have found that managing at the pollinator level, even reintroducing or bringing back some forbs and flowering species for the monarch butterfly and the bees, and I've tried to keep honeybees in a hive, but they keep moving out. So it makes gathering honey difficult, and because the habitat is so good, and I got that canyon, which is a whole microclimate in itself, with streams in it that didn't even go dry during these drought years, and so they got water and all kinds of habitat. Better, apparently they like it better than the hive, and but again, working at that pollinator level, getting to my largest animal, the deer, I've been able to raise some really nice trophy bucks that I don't say a whole lot about that too in the neighborhood, because I would have too many people trying to hunt on me.
So how many acres do you farm manage?
195. It's a quarter section and a 40.
And is this a historic family farm? Is this
Not,
been in the family? Or?
my dad bought that farm, and when he bought it, it was covered in brush and he had it cleared. And I can remember putting the fences in when I was in high school. And so I did a lot of work on it when he bought it, and did a lot of work himself and had it, some grasses planted, but he wanted me to have that farm. And then after he passed several years, my mom kept it for me. Situation happened when the neighbors wanted to rent it and pestered her so bad, she after she finally sold cattle, she rented to him. It was next to where he lived, and he dumped all of his cattle onto it and terribly overgrazed it, and the brush came back. And after a few years, my brothers and sisters said, we really need to get him off there. And she said, okay, I'm going to divide the land up. And then that's when I inherited it. And so it's still working at that time. I would take a few holidays or a few days and go out and try to work on some of the brush. But when I did retire, there's one thing I was very thankful for, and one of them was because I didn't have a lot of my plans for retirement done. I decided this is what I need to do with that reorganization about to happen. And I can remember that winter. The good thing was it was a good mild winter, no snow days, no ice days. But I wore out a chainsaw, had this huge pile of firewood stacked up, and I'm thinking, man, these chainsaws were not lasting as long as they were when I was working, because I wasn't working that many days, but when I was out there about every day for several months and getting rid of that brush. And anyway, just did that for several months full time. You know, I just packed me a lunch and go out to the farm and just stay out there all day, and just enjoyed doing that. But as I got active on conservation boards again and began to have less time out there, but every chance I get, I'm out there.
You're not going to lease it again.
No.
Learn that lesson, huh?
Yeah, but it's just where I enjoy spending the time I can, and that's part of. If I'm going to be semi-retired, gotta have some time for me.
Are either of your boys interested in the land doing similar things?
They, I know they enjoy it, and before they got active with kids of their own, we would go out and camp, and we haven't done that in several years. But and one son's down in Texas, the other is here in Weatherford, but just so busy that
other obligations get in the way.
Yeah, for sure, if it's work. They're working enough right now, I think that's why they feel. But
you had mentioned other canyon stories. What were you going to? You said we needed that.
I was just saying that yes, his place is part of these series of canyons, including the Red Rock Canyon State Park, that is out in that country that has some unique habitat, and it's really kind of a special place culturally. There's been tribes and then settlers that came west on wagon trains, stopped in these areas and things like that. It's very unique.
They're on my place in the not in 1835, get my century correct. In 1835, there was a cavalry unit sent to establish a trail west from Fort Smith. And what they did, they basically most of the way across the state, they followed the ridge between the Canadian drainage watershed area and the Ouachita watershed. Because for sure, before there was a lot of brush in the 1800s that encroached across so much of the state. Once we began to do away with fire and put up fences, that changed the ecosystem a lot, and the plant species became more woody, more brushy. They could ride that. You could read these stories that these cavalrymen wrote about coming through here and grass being up to the saddles, up to past their knees, sitting on a horse. And today I have got some of those grasses restored on my place. But they crossed my place because I'm on the ridge, a divide between the Canadian and the Washita. Then 1849, there's this thing called gold happening out in California. And Horace Greeley tells everybody go west, young man. So over 40-some thousand wagons in a period of just a few years head west. And so they follow this trail that these cavalrymen established in 1835. So I got wagon ruts on the sand rock on my place from these wagons. Because they would stop at one or two places. They would either stop at my farm in my canyon, and the total depth of the canyon is probably 180 feet. It's a deep canyon. And you've heard of Red Rock Canyon State Park, which is further west of mine. Then there's this mound called Rock Mary further west of that. And before you come up, as you're coming along that ridge and before you get to my place, it's hard to see now due to all the trees that have grown up. But there's only one spot that I have found where you can see on that ridge where you can see Rock Mary several miles away. And that was what they would look to the west as one of their points that they're still on the trail. But the thing about driving on that trail, when they're up on that ridge, they could see 50 miles, and that's part of the ride. They could see 50 miles practically either way. So they felt safer, particularly if you're going through wild country. You didn't know who might want to attack you to take what you have. And so they would not be surprised. Somebody couldn't sneak up on them, surprise them, and by staying on that ridge. But the thing is, when they got to these canyons, there were water streams and ponds down inside that canyon where they could gather fresh water. And the other thing about a canyon that deep, it was a whole microwave climate. You could take your livestock, there'd always be something to graze, your draft animals or other animals. Great camping spots, out of the wind, out of the elements, protected by those sandstone walls, vertical sandstone walls. And it's made, even today I can go down there, cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter. It's just one of those great feelings of being outdoors, and to experience that yourself is really kind of one of those things. It's a little bit strange if you haven't experienced it. To me, I just know it's there and I go enjoy it. So yeah.
Did you do that sort of thing when you were living on it as a teenager?
Yeah, I would go out there. Yeah, for sure.
Wow.
Yeah. Go down in the canyon and
didn't worry about rattlesnakes.
I haven't seen a rattlesnake there. I have seen a copperhead, but not a rattlesnake. Yeah. Well, and that was in the whole interesting thing about here over. When I say I come over here, this further west, and around the Weatherford area, I can remember the first time somebody found a rattlesnake, but it came in on a truck, and somebody had parked a truck because there weren't rattlesnakes. There was enough cropland in this area, for one thing, that there just never was any poisonous snakes. That's what the old timers told me as well. We got enough cropland. There's no good snake habitat.
Seems logical.
Well, it does. I took it for what they said.
So in Custer County, are there some unique or different type of issues you've had to deal with that you didn't have to at the other places you were in? Besides red cedar being an issue, I guess.
Yeah, and that's not typical. When you mention that, the only difficult thing I can remember that we really dealt with is when New York City wanted to send their sludge to Oklahoma. And that was a big controversy because they had targeted this area in our district here as an area to dump that sludge. And they were going to put it on a train and bring it out here and unload it.
Yeah.
That was difficult. That was a big thing. That was an issue that, and there, because it was being backed, I guess, by some pretty good money somewhere. Ship sludge that far just to get rid of it, but yeah.
Yeah, and why here? I mean, how?
Why here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I knew it. Part of it had to do because there was rail access, but on a railroad.
Some politician somewhere, possibly.
If there was, I never did know who that might have been, but I can remember we had several meetings, and some of the meetings were pretty controversial. Because some people might have thought, well, here's an opportunity to get some money, and I don't even remember how much I was willing to pay for acres that allow them to put the sludge on the land. But gee,
So, yeah,
you know, this water runs back to Oklahoma City. I think we did a good service in protecting Oklahoma City as well, our own land resources here.
Or do you know where they would have put it, or the location they were going to put it, actually dump it, where?
Now, primarily they were looking in where the railroads come into are
Just
north
at
of
the
here.
end of the line, huh?
Well, along the line, but
Yeah.
for sure. But it would have been on the Deer Creek, which goes into the Canadian River. And you think about how many towns are drawing water off the Canadian River.
So Larry, I'm glad you brought that issue up. I would like to hear, since you were here as DC for 19 years, what the issues were when you arrived here. You mentioned the sludge issue was controversial. How the work changed, or how the emphasis changed, and what are some of the major issues you worked on for your 2 decades here?
Well, we were dealing with some flooding problems on Deer Creek. We didn't have any upstream flood control on it. A lot of it was just wind and water erosion because what we're dealing with, the winds, and we did still have several windbreaks in place, but again, back in the 70s when there were some ag policies in place that put every acre back into wheat that you can. Anyway, that's a lot of political reasons that was happening, but so we did lose a lot of windbreaks protecting our soils. So it became, what can we do to protect our soils? To implement no-till conservation, tillage mulch, try to keep people from mowboarding as much as we could, but begin other ways to put cover on our croplands, keep that up. And that then Nrcs did offer us a special land treatment program on Deer Creek. And so we were targeted and received some financial assistance support through incentives as a cost share to implement practices. And so that was offered to me after I got here, and I having already worked on some of those kind of special land treatment projects. And so that became really a big focus. A major of our land areas, how getting those agreements, getting contracts. These were long-term contracts, at least 5 years. And for long-term, we'd go out and do a complete conservation plan on a farm and address all the resource concerns, the primary being wind and water erosion, and address those issues. And sometimes they would see an erosion problem, but not even know how to fix it. So they thought, well, that's just the problem I got to deal with. And we begin to, hey, we got a solution for that. If you do this or this, offer them a couple of alternatives, that can no longer be a problem. And so we did a lot of that work, and that's where I said earlier, we begin to see some benefits in how much reduction of flooding on the Deer Creek itself that we were able to mitigate. So that's really where we began a lot of that focus, and those were some of the big issues.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to think how that might have changed over those 19 years. Because we did start a lot of education programs, both with the children, the adults,
Mm-hmm.
and then it seemed like the funding just really got to be an issue over time.
Yeah.
And both any kind of state funds and federal funds, and that became probably one of the bigger issues during those last years. That we just began to see that money just wasn't available, just wasn't there anymore.
And you probably got to work on a couple of interesting upstream flood control issues in the southern end of the district, if I'm not.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And having experience coming out of Grady County, or a lot of, that's all practically all that's Washita River, and we had a lot of flood control structures there. And even the eastern side of the state, we would have issues, but dealing with those landowners and understanding what some responsibilities are and how to maintain and operate those.
Mm-hmm.
Seen a lot, and two different sites were, and this coming through the 80s and dealing with some of that oil boom issues, and too much of the operation was we'll just do what we want. We're a big oil company. If we do something wrong, we'll just pay for it or ignore it. So I remember driving by one site one time and I saw these flags out by the road. It made me curious. I wonder what's going on. So I drove in there heading back towards one of our upstream flood control structures. So I go into there, and a pipeline company had cut a great big hole through the dam of a high hazard flood control structure. They had come around what we call our conservation pool, where the floodwaters are stored, dug a ditch through there, dug it through the dam itself, huge cut, wide open this dam, and start digging that ditch across the tail end of the principal spillway pipe. When you see that, it's
not a good day.
It is not a good thing. You're having a bad day. All right. And so I tell some of the guys working there, I said, you guys can't do this. And they try to give me a few excuses. So I said, well, found out who I needed to call that individual up. And I believe she was in charge of easements or something. So I explained to her easements on these flood control sites that she was not well aware of, or the whoever did the background check. And that's what we've seen in recent terms is a lot of these land rights individuals only look at easements for 30 years. They only go back on abstract 30 years. Well, our flood control structures go back to the 50s and 60s. So we're talking about, they need to go back further. Yeah. And so we're taking that as a reason that they thought they could do what they wanted to do. But I said, but you can't do it. We do have prior easements on anything you've done out there, and you can't put a pipeline in the flood pool, and for sure you can't cut it down. And so she asked, well, what do we need to do? I said, well, I need to get some engineers out here from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and we got to start from there. See how we can remedy this situation. So they got the engineers out. They designed some ways they can keep that pipeline in there, and they had to put concrete ballasts on all the pipe inside the flood pool, and they had to put anti-seep collars on the pipe as it went through the dam, and they had to properly backfill the dam. So we had to basically do a total rehab issue before we were having rehab. And then after that, by several years, a few years or something, I go out to another site to do an annual inspection, and I see this drilling rig on this little mound on the west edge of this dam. Okay, the only way they got up there was on this dam. So I go over there, and sure enough, they had cut the dam 1.5 feet down so that the road would be wide enough to drive these trucks on. They pushed the extra dirt into the spillway, the auxiliary spillway of this structure. So you have the spillway there for a design purpose for a certain width and elevation, along with the dam needs to be high enough to contain floodwaters. All that was gone. So I get a hold of that company. He says, you can't do that. And anyway, they said, well, we're about through with this rig. I think they dry holed it. And they got the rig off there and got their equipment out of there and put it back the way it needed to be. You deal with some issues over time. Okay. And we still deal with, and I have dealt with issues where I go out and find concrete dumped into those towers that are taking the controlling that main flood waters for the permanent streams. But anyway, and seen them weld all kinds of things.
You get into legal issues then.
Yeah. And if it's a landowner doing it, and sometimes they get more contentious than an oil company because when you have the rights and they realize it, they just got to ante up. They got to pay for it. They know they got to pay land damages to a landowner anyway. But when you're endangering people's lives by doing this to a flood control structure, it's not a good thing.
Your blood pressure go up that day. So
It probably did. I didn't have to deal with that until later. But blood pressure being a thing. But.
And you would think that, okay, these things didn't show up or not natural, so someone's had to put them here for a reason.
Yeah.
So, common sense. But.
So Larry, I asked this question too, since you were a career SCS and Nrcs employee, what changes in the organization and emphasis have you seen over your career from when you started to when you retired and even today, since you're still working with Nrcs?
Technology has been huge, and in '83, the first computers were coming out, and I got the first field office computer here. And NRCS had one IT guy, and his experience came from computers because he was a Vietnam veteran and worked a lot with computers in the military. So he had way more advanced knowledge than I did. My knowledge came from my little brother, who was almost 10 years younger than me, and he when he was in high school, took a course at Redlands, and from a TRS-80 cassette run computer system, and he had a book, and I was kind of interested, so I took that and read the book, learned to do very, very simple programming on that Candy equipment, and somebody, state office, knew that I knew something. So anyway, that's why that computer was put here, and I began to see some ways, and working with Harold Kane there at the state office, and working with some individuals out of Fort Collins, because that's where the national system for soil conservation was. How can we use these in field offices? And I began to find ways to do conservation planning, my plans, my contracts, and my supervisor says, well, you can't just change a form. I said, yeah, but look at this. I can type these and cut and paste and do some things, and so much quicker than me penciling it, than somebody else typing it, and then making it readable. And well, you got to get it approved. So we sent it off, and Fort Collins approved that. I could do contracting off of a spreadsheet. And I learned Unix. Yeah, Unix was the first system, and because it was a math, it's not English. It's math.
Mm-hmm.
You have to think mathematical. And I could figure that out. I probably figured math out quicker than I can English, I guess. But anyway, so I learned that. But then they said, well, this DOS system, so DOS is the new operating system. So I learned it. And then when Windows came out, everybody can learn Windows. It's just point and touch, and it's all visual.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went through those 3 changes in technology on computer systems.
Mm-hmm.
And because I say when I started way back at Hinton, and you had well, even in high school you had that old is it mimeograph? What's that big old system had a crank handle on it?
Yeah, I remember that.
Purple ink smear everywhere.
Strong
That's how you made copies.
Yeah.
And during that summer at Hinton, they got the first electrical copier.
Uh-huh.
You take this pink-looking onion skin paper and another piece of paper, and you put your copy in it, and you run it through a heat thing, and it would make a copy. It stunk. It stunk as bad as that purple stuff in mimeographs. But watching go from that to these printers and copiers, we had technology has to be the biggest thing. The computers and laptops. We're looking at some of the offices getting it, putting in pickups where you could do that work from the field now. It's that. And in fact, you can go back here in the back and look at some of the old equipment the district has as far as surveying equipment. Look at some of that old equipment, and you needed at least 2 people. And when we'd run terraces, a lot of times there'd be 3 of us, 2 walking up and across the fields, and 1 with the instrument to sit there and
Mm-hmm.
do all the readings. But we did hand signals because we didn't have walkie-talkies. Because you're a half mile away, so you learn hand signals. We had designated hand signals,
Mm-hmm.
almost like a guy in the Navy on a ship. But anyway, so communications is part of that as well.
Cell phones now.
Yeah, cell phones where if you need to call somebody in the field, they need to call back to office. For years that wasn't a capability.
Does GPS come in? Probably some. I don't know.
Yeah, or even the GPS and the surveys now they could do with all the LiDARs and the satellites and stuff where they could, and that stuff has gotten so accurate
Mm-hmm.
that one person can go out and survey where before always a minimum of 2 people. And so
staff has continued to decrease then.
it really has. Too much, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in this building that we're sitting in, did the district itself come up with the money to build it? Do you know?
If you look on that picture on that back wall, you see the directors actually building this building.
Yeah.
The directors themselves.
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they built this building, and
In about what year, roughly?
oh,
It's paid for, I'm assuming, by now.
yeah,
Yeah.
40. I think they finished it at 49.
Oh. So 70 years.
So we're set up became a soil conservation district, and you see accommodation on the other wall from the local chamber of commerce, the president of the Rotary Club, the president of the Kiwanis Club. All 3 wrote a letter of commendation thanking the board of directors for establishing a conservation district and an office here in Weatherford.
Instead of the Custer County, there's a Custer County one too, isn't there?
Yes, well, and to mention changes and similarities, and I talked with the state conservationist Gary O'Neill about this. I said, your field office structure now resembles what it was like in the 50s and 60s. And being younger than me, he's like, really? Because as I mentioned, I started in 71 and worked with all these people that had been working since the 30s because they hadn't retired yet. And knowing that there were what was called work units, not districts. They were called work from the federal side, USDA side. And work units covered watersheds, multiple counties.
Mm-hmm.
County boundaries didn't mean a thing. They became, I don't know why they became more meaningful later on, but they did. Because we began establishing offices based on watershed boundaries. And these offices would work, so there was a office out of Levy, which is there's not an office in Levy anymore. But that office in Levy covered the upper Washita watershed area, which included the western part of Custer County, all the way through Roger Mills County, parts of Dewey County, where Levy's located, all the way out to the border. So you had a team working in a work unit, and as they begin to establish conservation districts, a work unit might cover multiple conservation district offices or boundaries. And that's a structure we have very similar going on now within Nrcs. They have established offices that serve more than one conservation district office. And that's what I was telling Gary. I said, well, you're going back to what looked like an old structure, the way it was when it started.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, in my opinion, it wasn't something really new. It was different. Of course, all the current employees, they were used to a structure. We're one office working with one district.
Yeah.
And that with the less number of employees, you need to be able to share those employees and get them where the work is needed. And again, not having a huge knowledge base and a skilled person. And I was thinking, I think I heard this week that there's actually in one of these team concepts, there's one conservation technician working in 7 different counties. I'm thinking that's a lot of travel. And how much time you end up spending traveling as opposed to actually being out in the field doing something.
Unless they do it virtually.
Well, we haven't.
Some things you can't.
Some things you can. We haven't really got there yet. And you ask about pushback for many landowners not wanting to adopt current conservation practices. For sure, those individuals need, in order to even have that conversation with them, you got to do it personal, one-on-one. You can't have that kind of conversation with average age of our producers at approaching 60, 50 something, 8, whatever it is, 9, something. I know it's in that average, and that's what I've always. And to me, I still like that and prefer conversations face to face.
And the handshake.
Serving on some national committees and doing a lot of national work as well. I have to learn to appreciate teleconference, doing stuff on the internet, because you can't bring that kind of, in the same way when you look at it on our terms now, you can't share that kind of expertise or time with a lot of travel. So you need some virtual ways of doing that, some way to communicate electronically, but how do you do all that visually? It's
a lot of changes. What do you see like in the next 5 to 10 years if you were projecting forward? What do you think?
Oh, well, trying to make me a profit. How do you? Yeah, it's
on your organic farming or something else, making a profit.
Oh, he's prophesizing for the future.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
Prophesizing for the future.
Okay.
But when you say that, I think we'll continue to. That seems to be a trend. We'll see more. Any younger people, and I've dealt this in even doing the no-till things. I've had, and this is kind of another one of those good stories where working with a father and a son and then a grandson come along. The father who's starting to adopt the no-till of his father who's kind of resistant to changing, but after seeing all the benefits, he's running out to meet people in the driveway when they come to ask questions about no-till because he's now seen all the benefits of what his son is. The grandson said, I'm not going, he said, I don't enjoy being a full-time tractor driver. I got tired of that when I was a kid. I'm going to college and get a degree and go do something else. And they had seen when their father went to no-till and somewhere watching his dad change what he's doing, the same way that the grandfather saw some changes, then that third generation now, who a lot of these guys are in their 30s and starting to raise families now that I know who are back at the farm because they had an aha moment saying, I don't have to be a full-time tractor driver. I can do these no-till, these cover crops. I can do all these other things that's going to benefit the environment, benefit what I see as sustainability and being a little bit more profitable way to farm. So I see those things. So and the other trend I'm seeing is with this 20-something now, we'll come down to the next generation. There is an interest in raising food. They want to know where their food comes from. Mm-hmm. They're concerned about. They hear you hear all kinds of stuff going on. Some of it's exaggerated, but seeing benefits of raising their own food. And my wife makes this comment a lot of times as we're driving through the country and you don't see gardens like you used to. But in some areas, those gardens are coming back. Some young people have taken an interest and they're wanting to know how to do that. They want to know how to can even. And I tell the extension people in OSU that it's sad that they did away with the home economic stuff at a time when now we're seeing people interested in knowing that. But for a period of time, nobody was interested. Mm-hmm. And so I think urban type agriculture is going to be growing. I've seen this in some really stressed communities. USDA they offer some information, they offer some funding opportunities in what they call food deserts, where there's not access to good food within a region. Because there's a lot of areas, and even rural areas, and even in metro areas, if you're limited on your transportation and you can walk a mile to a convenience store, and that's the only source of food you have is out of a convenience store, highly processed foods, that's not that nutritional, yeah, that's an issue. Mm-hmm. So if we can establish more farmers markets, people growing stuff locally in a neighborhood, we've got some communities I've worked with on that issue in Oklahoma City. I've worked with Oklahoma City Public Housing. I've worked with individuals, communities, neighborhoods who are doing community gardens, backyard gardens. And in fact, one of our programs at a recent national meeting, we had speakers on that issue alone. And they would talk about going into a blighted neighborhood where drug was out in the streets. Once they started the community gardens, got people talking together over the fence, and even gardening in the front yard, the drug situation goes away. Community comes back. And so I think that is going to be a trend. We'll see more and more of that kind of stuff.
That'll be your next conference.
It's going to work its way back in.
Speaking of conferences, Larry, I think you mentioned that you were involved in professional societies and such, and I don't know that you've addressed your longtime leadership in the Soil and Water Conservation Society and what that meant to your career and some of the activities and leadership positions you had there.
Yeah, I've done that all the way from the local to the international level for the Soil and Water Conservation Society. Again, that was something I saw from Charles Tarrant. Mm-hmm. I became a member. Well, actually, you couldn't be a member in high school because I wasn't there. Mm-hmm. But as soon as I started college, I became a student member of the Soil and Water Conservation Society. And they didn't even have a student chapter when I became a student member. Mm-hmm. So I worked with the agronomy club and said, okay, you can start a student chapter of SWCS, but it'll be under the agronomy club. So I did that, and we got several members to join, and anyway, started there as president of the student chapter at OSU. Then when I graduated, of course, I've been a member ever since.
Mhm.
in 1972. And so we, at that time, we had several chapters, what we call chapters within the state of Oklahoma. Served in all the officer positions as president of one of our regions in Oklahoma. We consolidated all the regions into one state chapter, and have served as all the officers on the executive council for the state chapter of SWCS. And then went on to serve on the International Board of Directors for the Soil and Water Conservation Society, representing the Southwest region. So I represented Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, and would visit those chapters serving in that position. Did that. I was limited to 2 terms, so that was 6 years I served on that international board. And so did that. But I actually was asked to serve on the international board, but I was still serving as a school board and served as president of that for some time. But anyway, I said, as soon as I get off that board, I didn't have that much time. So after I completed 10 years there, I went on and did 6 years on the international board at SWCS. And since then, I have helped put on symposiums and done presentation at that conference. And that was a great organization, which I feel like so many of our president employees within Nrcs failed to reap those benefits, because that's where I gained so many ideas and innovations came out of going to those national meetings and listening to speakers and gaining some insight. And it's those kind of connections it's broader than just staying at home, where you kind of see where trends are coming and going.
Networking too.
Sure.
And all of that. The other thing you were involved with was SPARC. Is that at the Southern Plains?
Yeah, the Southern Plains Agricultural Resource Coalition.
Yeah.
We created that organization, and the idea on that, there's a lot of ideas on that, was, of course, one of the main things we were promoting was, of course, no-till. And in addition to that is where I did those tests on wheat and seeing the benefits of grain. And part of what the vision within that group was to really step up the game in conservation, but it was also to see, can we get some income derived to benefit those individuals who are doing a good job. And how can we get value added to the products, to that healthier food that they're producing? And so I began looking at ecosystem markets and seeing that. And when I mentioned New York City a while ago, a really interesting fact about New York City is they don't have garbage disposals. It's against the law. You cannot dump food waste down the drain. So it goes into compost or landfills. The other thing is they don't have water treatment. They don't have to treat the water before it goes into the city infrastructure. The residents, and they found it to be cheaper, the residents of New York City pay out on the land for those watersheds to be protected from chemicals, from erosion. They keep their water clean, knowing that keeping it when the rain falls, keeping that water, because that's when it comes down as a raindrop, it's about as good as it can get. And so if they can put it in a reservoir, keeping it that clean, if they need to move a dairy or pay that dairy farmer to put in riparian buffers and do things to control that runoff and protect any effluent from running into a stream, they pay the money there to those people out on the land. And I have seen it's more than half. It would cost them, if they didn't do that, they would spend more than double the amount of money on a water treatment facility. And so some of the cities, even Los Angeles, with all the stuff that goes on in California, they have realized They need to get rid of that concrete off the LA. Made me think of Louisiana. From Los Angeles, the Los Angeles River, which you see in those movies, and they're doing that great car chase down that concrete channel. That is the Los Angeles River. Since it's all concrete, when it rains, that water immediately runs out to the ocean. That's why there's no continuous stream in that river, which used to have a continuous stream. Because all the biology is gone. They have realized they need to, and they're starting to tear up all that concrete, putting biology back in that river and finding out they can control the stream. They have better water quality issues instead of just like flushing it out into the ocean all at once. So that's ecosystem management. And when I sell at the farmer's market, I made up a sign of everything I raise that's offered for sale. Then I put on the bottom part of my sign all the things I do for free. I do pollinator habitats. I do wildlife management. I'm protecting the streams. I have better water quality. I don't have wind erosion. I've got clean air. And I'll start listing. Mm-hmm. And people can read that when they come into the farmer's market and see the message. I pay you for your vegetables, but I get all this for free. Yeah. Yep. There is an ecosystem consortium, another new trend that is now, which I didn't have a big enough consortium, but I think now there is a consortium because since I did the Spark stuff, more of the corporations, General Mills is huge in this, some others, and inside the food industry, who want to be able to put that label on their product because people are wanting to buy those products that are providing environmental benefits. You see all kinds of stamps on food products. So the marketing is a big thing, and I think how can we capture some of those dollars in marketing, but get it back to who's doing it, not mm-hmm. just because somebody put the label on a box or a package. Mm-hmm. And that was one thing we really were hoping to accomplish more in Spark. But I think through this ecosystem consortium that's going on now, enough people are becoming players that, and I'm hopeful that, hey, let's put the money back on the land where those benefits are, not just because we bought it from them at a commodity price, but give them the value added. Mm-hmm. So that's been a hope of mine as well. But.
So you don't need to retire a second time anytime soon.
Well, and my other retirement took away a lot of my time and effort from that one thing. And that was part of the reason I did retire. One of the reasons. Some other reason I'll see is benefit, some issues, but it's because I want to keep doing some of that. And if I stayed on as an employee, that program was going away, and I was not going to be allowed to do that kind of work because it's not a federal program. It's not in the federal allocations anymore. And I want to continue to revitalize rural America, mm-hmm. and I can't do it if they focus me in a different direction. So.
Switch gears a little bit.
A little bit.
Anything else, Ben?
We've covered the waterfront.
Anything else you can think of? We need
anything
to cover?
Else, yeah, that you'd like to share?
Oh.
Oklahoma Wildlife and Prairie Heritage Alliance.
Another group I'm working with, a nonprofit. We and a project within that group we're working on is what we call the Great Plains Trail of Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And within that group we work on, and that's covering all of western Oklahoma, but part of that is we want to get through that nonprofit organization access to our landowners, not only to help them access any federal programs, to help them do a better job through our local conservation districts or Nrcs or USDA or wherever. We can help deliver some programs, But under the Great Plains Trail, we were able to raise some monies. We created our own map. And on that map, we put wildlife management areas, state parks. We put public access areas on this map. We set up 13 different areas that you could drive, make a day trip and look at this area. But we also included private lands, individuals who had an agritourism or, like in my case, I got this great canyon. It's just, great place to visit and look at. And the bird species, if you're a bird watcher, you could check off that you wouldn't be able to check off unless you drove clear to Arkansas or somewhere else. And keep you here in Oklahoma doing these things. There's birders traveling the country who are looking for destinations. So we have all these destinations already identified and listed and tell them what species they might be able to find. And we're in the process of making that total virtual as well, as because people carrying these smartphones, they can follow a map on their smartphone easier than they can a paper map, and they can access so much more information.
Yep.
So we're creating all that database to be online, available that way as well. Setting up QR codes where they can punch on it and get instant information on what else to do. So that's just, and we're doing all that in a nonprofit situation.
And I'm thinking education again, so your mother should be checking more off. Your constant ideas bubbling. What do you do for downtime?
Sleep.
Go to the canyon?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a great stress relief, just being out there. Even if I'm doing all the work with the fighting brush with a chainsaw or clippers or whatever I'm fighting with at the moment, but physical activities, just being outdoors, has always been good for me.
And if you're enjoying what you do work-wise, it's not really work, I guess. Anything else? Anything else?
I don't know. I think what we said and haven't said.
Did you have an opinion on the name change from Full Conservation Service to Natural Resources?
I think that was a good name change.
You think it's a good one?
That, for sure, because we dealt with all the natural resources. It wasn't just soil. We dealt for sure with the water quality issues. Because people would separate wildlife and water and soil in 3 different categories when really they're all dependent. And so the name shows you the interrelationship of all of our natural resources. And as a technical agency, you can't get better advice, assistance on how to take care of some of those issues. And as a landowner, and you're interested in all those things. And I think the stewardship ethic within, and was something I saw immediately after coming to Weatherford. There was a great conservation stewardship ethic of these landowners. And I know, again, some exaggeration trying to portray farmers as people who are just mining the soil or out there reaping the environment. No, these individuals, they want to leave a legacy. They want to leave something to the next generation of the grandkids. So they're out there to do a good job. And sometimes they just need a little bit of assistance.
I'm thinking when you finally came back here, was your mentor very excited that you were back in the area? Your mentor?
Maybe so. He would come. He would come over to visit, and sometimes I'd come in from the field, and he's sitting in here waiting for me just to visit.
Had he retired by then? Had he retired?
Oh yeah. He'd been retired several years by the time I got here, but and I never did get to think him well enough.
That's a great story too.
Yeah.
Then my last question is, how do you want to be remembered? How do you want people to remember Larry Wright?
To be remembered is you think about all the labels people carry, and you start out as a baby, as a son, as a brother, as a, I think about all those labels. But if I was going to have to call myself a label, the first word I would use would be Christian. And I could put all these other son, husband, father, grandfather. Grandfather's been a fun one to add.
Yeah.
It really has. And I could say, for many years I could not understand when a mom would bring a baby into the room and all the air goes out of the room from all the other moms or ladies. I didn't get that until I had my first grandson. I started to understand. You know, why did the air go out of the room? I can do that now. I can appreciate somebody else bringing in a baby, and yeah. Mm-hmm. And one of my previous pastors, when he became a grandfather, and I sent him a text and told him how much I appreciated him, how happy I was for him. As a grandfather, you're not just a pastor, but you are our grandfather pastor. He told me later, he said, that was the best thing anybody said to him. And when you become a grandparent, it's a whole nother experience. So I'm just glad I got 3 grandkids that I can see almost every day. And that granddaughter who's taken in a lot of interest.
And you have the property you can take them back to and show them hands-on
Well,
what Grandpa did.
And the grandson, he is 4. He'll be 5 in February. He's 4. Pops, take me on a Jurassic adventure. That means he wants to go into the canyon.
Yeah.
Take me on that. Let's go on a Jurassic adventure. That's his words. And so we'll go into the canyon.
That's really cool. Making good memories.
Yeah.
Sounds like you've got good ones from your work too. So
I do, and that's a lot of it. And some people didn't know I ever did retire because they kept seeing me. And but I've worked with the best people, and I really have. Rural people are great. I've done a lot of work in urban areas, and I'm finding some great people there too. But it was, to me, for so much of my career, it was always the draw, working with some of the best people in the world.
well, Oklahoma's lucky that you decided to stay in Oklahoma.
And that's because I find a lot of the best people are in Oklahoma. So I said no to some opportunities to leave.
Okay. Yeah. I wondered if that had come up. It seems to have come up with most folks.
I've been a teacher of a lot of USDA programs of facilitation, being Rcnd court, doing a lot of facilitation and going to Washington, D.C. to facilitate some meetings up there. And because I did at one time in my early career look at that career path that would lead you to Washington.
Be the chief, maybe?
Well, when I started, there wasn't that many steps to get to chief as there are nowadays. Because they've added deputies and unders and associates and regionals that didn't exist in 1970. And you think about early conservation within the Soil Conservation Service. Okay, my supervisor was a DC, he had an area conservationist, he had a state conservationist. I don't think they even had regions then. You might have had a deputy chief, then you had the chief of Nrcs, 5 steps. One more step put you up to secretary of ag. They didn't have all the undersecretaries. 7 steps was the president.
He's thought about this. So.
But then I saw the benefits of staying in the state, and the Rcnd job just fit me so well because I could do all my interests, not just the conservation side. I could do those rural things for other rural people, even begin to work with urban people. And even now, even our local conservation districts are doing more urban stuff. And there's the organics, hoop houses, things to do as far as organic farming and other ways to farm is a lot more opportunities. We're doing more outreach, offering that information to them, to those individuals that have that interest. So yeah.
More ways to leave your imprint too. So, been a good career.
It has been.
It's not over yet.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing about it.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I got the opportunity. Yeah.